Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 609. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. The Software Process and Measurement Cast 609 features our discussion with Dr. David Rico. Dave has appeared multiple times on the Software Process and Measurement Cast. I would suggest checking them all out. They are all fonts of information. But today we discussed Agile and collaborative contracts. It's a new and explosive field. It really requires you to think about why you're doing Agile and how to get that into a contract. Dave has some excellent advice about what really needs to be in a very basic Agile contract. Dr. Rico has been a technical leader in support of NASA, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, U.S. Army for over 30 years. Over the past 30 years. He's a Certified PMP, CSEP, ACP, CSM, and SAFe Agilist, and teaches at 4 Washington, D.C. area universities. He's been in the field of information systems since 1983. Are you ready to write a contract in Agile? It's time for the interview. Dr. David Rico, welcome back to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It has been a while, and so Dave, this is it's always exciting when somebody comes back, and I'm glad you're here.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
So today, I'd like to talk about the whole idea of collaborative contracts. What are they, and why should we care about them?
Well, great. That's a great question. I'll try to keep it short and sweet to begin with. Really, the most basic name is an Agile contract to really differentiate between traditional, very legalistic, fixed scope contracts. They're basically contracts that work a little better in theory and practice with both lean and Agile methods, just based on a high degree of vertical and horizontal social interaction, where both the buyer and the supplier, both vertical as well as horizontal relationships, when you have horizontal teaming relationships, sort of, carry the workload together of both success, risk, and failure.
In these circumstances, does most contracts, I would suggest, are relatively low trust scenarios, right? And that's why you have lawyers involved in 50 pages of stipulations in these contracts. So to do something like a collaborative contract, do we have to change the whole paradigm of trust?
Well, I think that's basically one of the natures of the underlying principles or values, the fabric, the DNA, the gene structure of the entire lean and agile paradigm is this notion of we're going to increase trust, not through traditional mechanisms such as processes and documents and even metrics and schedules. Those are the old ways. If you delivered a lot of documents, people said, oh, this is great. It was the old weight test. The heavier the specification, the greater the trust. And we sort of programmed people over 50, 60, 70 years to give it the old weight test. If you had lots of documents and measurements, that sort of made us feel very, very comfortable. I've known many, many people that spent their entire careers that measured program success on the weight of the documents and the processes. So we kind of tried to flip that upside down and said, let's not put it on the process. Let's put it on the outcomes. What's happening in the end? Are you getting working software? Are you getting working systems? Are you getting products of value? So we tried to change the whole trust paradigm on let's trust the outcome, not the process. Don't show me how the sausage was made. Just give me some really, really great tasting sausage. And it took a while. I think we're starting to get there now. The lean and agile phenomenon, at least in the IT world and the knowledge sector, is about 30 years in. And I think we're starting to see some adoption where people are saying, I would rather trust an outcome than a process or a document or a measurement. So we're trying to say that seeing a successful outcome, seeing not a blueprint for a great house, but a really great looking house that's move-in ready, I think that increases trust at a great price.
If we factor in the idea of shorter feedback loops, which is obviously part and parcel of how Agile and most lean processes work, we still have to see outputs pretty quickly to build that trust, don't we?
Absolutely, and you brought that in. So I think when Lean and Agile first, started lifting, especially in the IT sector about 25, 30 years ago, we focused on outcomes like, deliver. We're going to deliver faster. But I think you really hit on the modern essence. What we've learned. We said you should continuously improve in retrospect and get better, and I think we are. And part of that is to shorten the feedback loops. It's not, we believe that outcome is not a destination but a journey. So we shorten the feedback loop to get the feedback to improve the outcome. It's only through a successful refinement and evolution that we really, build up trust. You might not trust the first delivery. You might not trust the second delivery, but maybe the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth. So the point is not to put all the money in the bank on the first delivery, but to show that trust actually accumulates over time. And I think that's really where we're growing. I think that's why we made the traditionalists so nervous, is because they didn't really want a one-time fast delivery without all the traditional QA. They wanted a great delivery, even if they had to wait 10 or 20 or 30 years. But what we're now saying is, okay, you don't put all your trust in the first delivery, but eventually the third and the fourth and the fifth by shortening the feedback loops.
How do you think that holds up if the business cycle turns, as most people expect it to in the next few months, to a highly cost-conscious scenario?
Well, I'm not sure that was a fairly abstract question, but I really think that this is our hour. People didn't realize it, but we've been doing remote, virtual, agile products for the better part of 20 years. I think the current COVID-19 crisis just showed us that we can successfully execute, lean and agile projects with short feedback cycles and do it successfully. So if we didn't have 20 years under our belt, you and I wouldn't be talking here today. And even for me, because many lean and agile frameworks and models are built on the entire notion of face-to-face framework. So I've been doing lean and agile in a face-to-face setting for the better part of 15 years. So it took me a little bit of trust that can we continue this paradigm, in a remote setting. And I've learned over the last 8 weeks that the answer to that question is yes, and I'm starting to love it. But it took me 8 weeks just to get over that trust factor. Can we take an inherently face-to-face model and be successful in a remote setting? And I think we're all learning together that the answer to that is yes, and still have that trust. I think the answer. But we still have to convince people not to fall back to the old way because we're in this remote setting. Let's go back to traditional processes and documentation. I think we have to convince both the traditional community as well as the Agile community that the Agile paradigm still works in a remote setting. I don't need a 400-page specification to work remote.
But I do need a 400-page Microsoft project schedule, right?
That's sort of kind of one of the last battlegrounds, bastions of the traditional mindset that I'm trying to move people away more towards value streams, Kanbans, sprint boards, program boards, and Jira tool boards and Rally boards and IOBEA boards and PI planning.io boards. I'm trying to get and mural boards. You can do mural boards, make really great sprint boards, and I'm trying to get people to sort of kind of wean them off the integrated master schedule and say we just don't need that anymore. We don't need long-term plans for short feedback loops. Every feedback loop is going to obsolete the integrated master schedule, and so I'm trying to get people wean off that. We're seeing a lot of big high value programs saying, great, we want lean and agile, but we still want our IMS and EVM. And I'm going, and a lot of lean and agile, consultants are willing to say yes to that proposition just to get the business. And I'm shaking my head saying, no, we don't need a 30-year integrated master schedule when our feedback loop is going to change all of our assumptions in 3 to 5 business.
Yeah, over and over and over and over and over again.
Over and over and over and over again. That's absolutely correct.
The overall amount of burden that you put on the project, I think, is actually substantially larger in that circumstance than even if you had done it via the traditional path. Not that
unfortunately, you hit on a big question because I see a lot of project managers still demanding. That's the entrance criteria. In order to walk through the door, you have to be ready to give them an integrated master schedule in a couple of days. And I'm going like, why?
What's the answer when you say why? Or was that a rhetorical why?
That was a rhetorical question. That was a rhetorical question. And there are a couple of answers to that. I think there are probably more people saying let's do lean and agile than let's do traditional. But occasionally you do kind of walk through a blind door and realize maybe you shouldn't be behind that door. And I've been in a couple of those situations.
Or I've recently run into let's do hybrid. It's important to be hybrid, and the hybrid is we'll do all this other stuff, and maybe we'll just employ people off to the side. It won't even connect, and it's like, oh, what is this? What is this problem here that we're attempting to solve?
Yeah, there's a lot of big six consultants that see they're there to get Fortune 5, top 5 or 10 Fortune 500 companies, and they need to come in with comfort food. And part of that comfort food is, yes, we'll do hybrid. We'll give you the schedule and we'll give you the Kanban. And we need people like that to kind of wean the top 10, Fortune 500 firms, global 500 firms off the traditional paradigm. It's a baby step. I don't like it. It's a baby step, but one of these days, and not that far in the future, we don't have to walk in the door to a top 10 firm and say, yes, we're going to give you an integrated master schedule. We can say, you're going to succeed with that one. And that's not that far off.
And they'll buy it. When we talk about going back to collaborative contracts again, are there principles that drive that? Or what would be the entry criteria for actually making that work?
Absolutely. And I don't consider myself a pioneer in this area. We were doing a large agile transformation for a large national bank. And I was brought in as the process coach to kind of help them, install the agile processes. And they brought in this other coach who said, well, how do we do this from a legal and a contracting standpoint? And he said, stop specifying the scope, the process, the deliverables, the requirements, the schedule. Just specify in the contract that you agree to exhibit agile behaviors. You'll have a product owner. He or she will own the backlog. You'll agree to do sprints. You'll do daily stand-ups. You'll do, sprint demos and retrospectives. And that's all the contract is going to say. So at a very minimum, these contracts, the entry criteria is you're going to exhibit basic agile behaviors. Now we have to go beyond that. It's great. And you'll succeed. If all the contract says exhibit these basic agile behaviors, you'll be 3 or 4 times better. But if you want to be 10 or 100 times better, now start stipulating the degree of collaborative interaction, especially between the buyer and the supplier, that the buyer has to come down to the level of the supplier, or the supplier has to be elevated up to the decision-making and authority level of the buyer. Not only that, but they have to go horizontal relationships, because you can have multiple suppliers, providing a large solution, and each of those suppliers will have multiple contractors or firms within their team, and you have to agree to collaborate, vertically as well as horizontally. So basically, they have to stipulate a high degree of social interaction, as well as trust and egalitarian decision-making, sharing the risk, sharing the success, and saying that you're going to lift together, that both the buyer and the supplier are going to lift the load together, because oftentimes these contracts stipulate that the buyer will tell you what he or she needs, and the contractor, the supplier, is responsible for doing all the heavy lifting. But the fundamental collaborative behavior is a horizontal relationship where you lift the load together. It's just agreeing to lift the heavy load together.
That requires not only to stipulate that interaction, but that also would suggest cross-functional teams, or at least buyer and supplier on the same team.
Agreed. And we've done this in the past for 30 years. We've experimented. Many of the agile behaviors, processes, metrics, we've been experimenting, for the last 40, 50, or 60 years. Agile didn't come out of thin air. They were built on the principles and practices of 100 years. And one of this was this notion of a one team, a badgeless team, where each cross-functional team has members from each of the suppliers and each of the buyers, right? And there is no badge. In some agencies, the buyer has one color of badge and the supplier has another color of badge, and the subcontractors to both have another color of badge. And it's an immediate tool for discrimination, and say, oh, if you've got that color of badge, you lift more, you do more work. If you have that color of badge, you do a little work. And if you have that color of badge, you don't have to work at all. And the point is to put everybody on the same playing field, take off the badges, and work together to carry the load. So yes, that does require, and you stipulate that in the contract that you're going to do that.
So this can happen where you can make those stipulations. There are environments where that isn't legally possible.
I would like to hear what some of those are. I mean, I shouldn't point fingers, but I remember talking to a gentleman in a government contract, and this was about, good 5 or 6 years ago. And we were having this very conversation, and he said, no, I'm the guy that establishes contracts for multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade Department of Energy contracts. And I stipulate in the contract that there shall be no buyer-supplier interaction because there might be some collusion. And I believe that collusion between buyers and suppliers is bad and illegal. And I'm like, yeah, I'm shaking my head. This is exactly the type of barriers, communication barriers that I live to try to break down and eliminate. So when you have people carving out multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade contracts that say, there shall be no collaboration between buyers and suppliers, that worries me a little bit.
And maybe it's the word that's troubling, but I agree. So that lack of communication, those barriers to communication, can only result in doing stuff multiple times because you're doing it blind, throwing it over the wall, and hoping. And we're back to where we were in the 1980s. Your hair is much darker than mine, but I can tell you that at least if you go back to the 1980s, stuff would come to you and then it would go back. And it's like, that's not exactly what we want. Try again, kind of thing.
And W. Edwards Deming has been telling us 100 years to do it right the first time, right? And that if you work together, you will increase the probability of doing it right the first time by at least 10 times. And that's what we're talking about, is shortening those feedback loops. If I can say, hey, Tom, if you're the buyer, and I could say, hey, Tom, what did you mean by this user story? See, that user story is not a requirement. It's an agreement to have a conversation. Hey, Tom, what do you mean by this user story? Did you really want a 3 petabyte database? And you say, no, I really didn't want a database, even though that's what I said. What I really wanted was a 40 terabyte storage solution with this really, really nice Power BI, dashboard. And see, we would not know that unless, you and I had that conversation, because you might have written that user story or paid somebody to write that user story about 18 months ago. And in that 18 months, your understanding of your needs have evolved and changed. So just because you wrote something in a contract 18 months ago doesn't mean that it still applies today. So you shouldn't be specifying you shouldn't be specifying scope or requirements in contracts, but behaviors, and those behaviors are you're going to talk to your supplier about each and every requirement or need that you have today.
Both of us are SPCs. Can these form of contracts work on release trains or large enterprise level SAFe where we have other integrated organizations?
That was a kind of a big question. If you mean, can they operate at enterprise level in terms of business agility or portfolio level when you have many suppliers, or even large solutions where you have multiple contractors and solution trains? I think they have some minimum effects at scale. I think what you want to do, and we realize this more and more, is to understand the value stream, from concept to cash, and being able to carve out a tightly scoped agile release train, that they can deliver value quickly, and understanding what those impediments are. So SAFe has some built-in mechanisms to help you evolve your agile release train in order to minimize your dependency feedback loops and impediments and barriers to success. I've been on big government programs, and it takes leadership buy-in, right? This is when you're talking about doing something at scale, and the value of these contracts is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The only people that can drive those changes are the very leaders themselves, and that means that the leader has to be committed to retrospecting and inspect and adapt every 90 days, and modifying that art, in order to optimize the flow and performance, as well as the flow of value. So I've seen it work. It's not easy. And I think if you have too many moving parts, 17 suppliers, half of them are traditional, half of them are agile, and 3 of them don't know what they want to be when they grow up, that makes it a little more complex. So what you've done is you've maximized your dependencies and your feedback loops, and because you've got this great model called the Scaled Agile Framework, and I'm like, wait a minute, slow down. Let's minimize the number of suppliers. Let's put everybody on the same art, and let's make this a little bit easy. We can either retrospect, every 90 days for the next 5 years, or if we try to do it right the first time, we can actually minimize the number of interactions, dependencies, and feedback loops, and maximize our success. So again, we have to go back to that principle of let's try to do it right the first time. Let's not say, well, because we're going to be retrospecting every 90 days, we'll make our solution the most complex imaginable today. There's a big. I'm learning that. That's something that I learned after 32 years in the business of. W. Edwards Deming was a pretty smart guy, and doing it right the first time really counts a lot.
I had a conversation with Kevin Cahill the other day. Kevin Cahill is Deming's grandson, and he's the Deming Institute. I'm a big fan and always have been of Deming. Dave, if you woke up tomorrow morning, somebody gave you a cup of coffee, magic wand, assuming you're a coffee person in the morning, and gave you the power to change any 2 things that impact how value is delivered, what would those 2 things be that you would change?
I think one of them is just a high degree, whether it's through contracting, collaborative contracts, agile contracts. It's just a high degree of collaboration between buyers and suppliers. You equalize that relationships and realize that horizontal relationships are just as important. There's an old principle in our field, an old adage. We say kissing up and kicking down. That is, we kiss up to our customers, but we kick down to our peers. So we've got to stop kicking down to our peers and realize that horizontal relationships are just as important as vertical relationships. So that would be principle number 1. And part and parcel to that is this whole emerging phenomena of emotional intelligence and social skills. I can't tell you how many leading agile consultants say, one of my strengths is social skills and emotional intelligence. And if I were to rate them on a scale, I would probably rate them as a 0. And including myself, I struggle from time to time with social and emotional skills. I'm one of the worst offenders. So what we have to do is, if we're going to collaborate, we've got to collaborate peacefully and kindly. And it's tough, especially when you're under pressure, right? To your scope is so large and you have a short period of time, and there's this tendency to overutilize and fill up every hour of a 24-hour day with Zoom meetings. It makes it a little really hard to exercise good emotional intelligence and social skills, because you just want to say, let's end this meeting now, damn it. And so there's this modern remote world. It's pressuring us. It's tempting us. It's so tempting to have 24-hour Zoom meetings, and and over allocate people to 5 different international projects, and give them such a large scope that it's impossible to do in a 24-hour day. And we've got to realize that we've got to lower utilization. We've got to single task more. We've got to shorten our workday. We've got to shorten our workday, our work week, and we've got to be social towards one another.
It really does boil down to some basic lean principles of controlling work entry and working to the constraint.
Right.
We laugh about the Zoom meeting thing. I was standing in my front lawn last night, doing the final walk of the dog of the evening, and I've got a nice size standard poodle, and a neighbor who's visiting, somebody who's run away, let their Irish wolfhound out. Irish wolfhounds are very large animals. Might as well have been a Shetland pony. So they're out wrestling, and guy say, "Oh, I'm sorry. I spent 5 hours on a Zoom call today, and then we decided to have a morale building 1.5 hour Zoom conference afterwards." We're remote is great. I can deal with remote, but at some point you actually have to do some work, and very frankly, work and meetings aren't always exactly the same thing. Dave, this has been fantastic. If people wanted to continue the conversation, wanted to learn more about things like collaborative contracts, how would they go about doing that?
Well, for one, you could just Google it, right? Because there's just so much great data out there on collaborative contracts. It's such a great phenomenon. But you can go to my website as well, davidfrico.com, just the way it sounds. Email me, dave1@davidfrico.com. I've got a nice web page, a lot of great resources, white papers on collaborative contracting. It's just such a rich field, and it's emerging, and we're still learning, and we're still early in the 21st century. There's more to come.
As you know, at this point, I open up the platform. This has been fantastic. It's, I filled up a page of notes for myself, and I'm sure the listeners have taken away a bunch. So we open up the platform for you to promote anything you like at this point.
I think I've pretty much done all of that. Definitely, come to my website, see some of my recent videos on DevOps, on lean thinking. I've got a great video on lean thinking. This is still a fairly new phenomenon in spite of its age, and I even have videos on the scaled agile framework and design thinking. So I'm trying to use my website as an outlet for bleeding edge, YouTube videos and things like that, and the topic of lean thinking. Some people are bored with the topic of lean thinking, and I'm trying to convince people that the field of lean thinking is not over yet. We're just getting started.
Super. Before we go, one last question. Lean and Agile, two separate things, related, not related? Your opinion?
Wow, that's a really good question. So I'm just going to give you my opinion. I think when they emerged, the term Agile actually came out of the lean manufacturing community around 1990, and it sort of became sort of its own phenomenon. I see a lot more convergence. I've been calling them kissing cousins for at least a decade, but we see a lot of convergence in those ideas. I think there are a lot of great value in some of the pure agile techniques, and a lot of great value in some of the pure lean techniques. And it's only when we sort of hybridize them and take the best of both worlds, and even add other things like user experience and DevOps and security and cloud computing. Only when we sort of kind of merge and converge them do we get our final solution.
Big box of Lego. Dave, this has been marvelous. Thank you for spending time with the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thank you, Tom.
In Reread Saturday News, this week we tackle Chapter 6 of Tame Your Workflow. Throughput accounting ties a number of threads together for me. The big one is the linkage between getting value from process improvement and the mental models created by cost accounting. Please remember to buy a copy of the book and read along. Buying a copy of the book using the link in the show notes helps support the blog, the podcast, and most especially the two authors. In the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 610, we will feature our essay, An Agile Team in a Waterfall Company, Organizing Around the Product Flow. This is another part of a larger essay that we began last week. We will also have a visit from Susan Parente with a discussion that I have named Agile or Traditional. Pick one. I know which one I would pick, and the answer might not be one of the two that I just gave you. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?